I am the co-founder of the Pollinator Posse. And my co-founder is Tora Rocha, who was a supervisor in public gardens in Oakland for a number of years. She was the first woman supervisor in that position. And she managed, whoops, what happened here? She managed the gardens around Lake Merritt, and that's where we met about 10 years ago. At the time, I was teaching fifth grade, or no, I had been teaching fifth grade. I was a science and math specialist at an elementary school nearby with the tradition of raising monarchs. And we met up one day in the garden. I didn't know who she was. I asked her for directions, and in the midst of the conversation, she shared that she had all these monarch caterpillars looking for a home, and it's been that kind of serendipitous relationship ever since. So we founded the Posse at that time. I'm also the president of Community for Lake Merritt, which is a nonprofit which supports the Rotary Nature Center at Lake Merritt in Oakland. Co-founder of Piedmont Connect. And then, as I mentioned, I'm a STEAM education specialist. The last 10 years of my teaching career, I was a science and math enrichment teacher at an elementary school in Piedmont, so they could afford to have a science and math enrichment teacher, and ran the school garden. So when Kim called me about speaking to you, I was so delighted. I was like, okay, these are my people. I've been talking to rose societies and various things lately, which nothing about roses, but they cringe a little bit when I talk about aphids. And so I'm delighted to be here. So I have that teaching background. That's kind of my side of the Posse. I do the teaching and outreach, and now some citizen science work I'll talk about. I'm also an artist, and you'll see evidence of that a little bit. And I have my own garden, which is a habitat garden, and designed for people to visit and get ideas about how they can garden with appropriate practices for pollinators and for humans and make use of the land. So the Posse itself is basically just a very loosely organized group of volunteers. Tora and I have both had plenty of experience on boards and at meetings, and we don't do that. Our goal is to learn and educate and observe, report, protect, plant, and collaborate. We just became a partner with Monarch Joint Venture, which is a national organization. And we also work very closely with Xerxes Society. So we're connected to these other groups. But basically things come to us. Up until recently, we basically, if somebody asked us to do it, we just do something, we were available to do it. But things have really picked up in recent times. So we're probably going to have to get a little more organized. I was telling Kim, I think this is my 10th talk in the last 2 weeks. So there's a lot of interest, which is wonderful. And I'll tell you more about some of our projects as we go along. So we do have a web page. It's incredibly outdated. The web person we just talked to recently laughed when she saw it. So we're in the process of redoing it, but I wanted to show you a few resources on here I'm going to be talking about. So if you go to pollinatorposse.org, this is the page that comes up, and this resources tab, you'll see this. Now, the things in blue don't look like they're links, but they all are links. And in particular, this first one, Pollinator Posse References and Resources, that takes you to a whole library on Google Docs of some of the things I'm going to show you tonight. The other thing I want to point out to you is this contact tab. 2 things you can do there. One, you fill out the contact form, and that basically writes an email that comes directly to me. So if you have questions after tonight or are curious or something you'd like us to get involved in, that's a great way to get in touch with us. The other thing you can do there is sign up for our email list. We don't send out emails very often, and they're very much to the point. So if you want to know about what we're doing or projects we have going on, that's a great way to do it. We also have a very active Facebook group, if you're into Facebook these days, with over 1,200 members. And that's actually how we've done most of our communication up until this point. But now with the issues about Facebook, we understand that there are people who don't want to go that route. So we also have the email list. So tonight, what I want to talk about is pollinators and their current status. I'm going to focus on monarchs as a representative because there's a lot of interest in that right now. But I'll be talking in general about pollinators as well. And then I'm going to talk about the posse and the outreach we do, first from a general perspective, and then some specific activities that we use that I've been working on for some time. One of my jobs when I taught science was I was responsible to create the curriculum K-5 for the science program. And so I'm very much into creating the activities or finding the activities that are really get to the point with kids and really get the idea across. So the first question I get from most people in my life is why focus on pollinators? And it really all goes back to plants. I've been a plant person my entire life. As has Tora, and we don't have plants without pollinators, and it's become increasingly clear that this is something that we need to work on. So just starting on pollinators, we start, when I talk about pollinators, the first thing people think about is honeybees. And they are very important pollinators, although they're not native to the US. They were brought in by the original colonists. And there's starting to be some issues about that with competition between honeybees and native bees. But also it's something that we don't focus on a lot because honeybees have their own PR from all the beekeeping organizations. There are a lot of people looking after their interests because they're basically a domesticated pollinator. They're kept by people, although some of them do get wild, managed in colonies and moved around. I will talk about how they're doing, but it hasn't been our primary focus. I do love to show these pictures. People are always incredibly surprised to see how furry honeybees are, which only makes sense when you think about the fact that you want the pollen to stick to them. And actually, if you look at those hairs, they're actually completely feathered. This is a picture at the bottom showing what those hairs look like. So, and they also, because they're so fine, they pick up on electrostatic charges. They're flying, so that pollen is going to stick to them. So we've heard all of this about colony collapse and how the bees are suffering, and they certainly are. My husband is a beekeeper. We have urban hives at our house in Piedmont. And like everybody else, we lose about half of our hives every year. What this graph shows, the dark gold or orangey bars are the average losses in percentage. So it's running around 40 to 50%. Pretty steadily. So those losses are high, but they are more or less holding steady for right now. It's certainly an area of concern. I mean, one of the things, I'm going to focus on a few pollinators tonight, but basically the issues that are going on for any pollinator are really true for all of them. And a lot of the mitigation strategies are also common to all of them. We do tend to focus more on the native bees. People are often very surprised to learn that there are over 1,600 kinds in California alone. They don't sting, they don't make hives, and they don't make honey, which are all the things that we associate with what bees do because of honeybees. They're usually single mothers looking for a place to lay their eggs. They're much more specialized by season and by plant, generally. And so they mate when they come out for their season, whenever their plant food source is up. And then the mothers are looking for places to lay the eggs. They'll die at the end of the season, and then those eggs will go until the next season. There are two different types of nesters. Some of them need to nest in bare dirt, so they actually tunnel into the ground, which means they need loose enough dirt to do that, if you can think of one of these little bees tunneling into the ground. Or they use cavities that are already in existence. So they might be holes drilled by another creature, a bird or whatever, or they might be the dead stems of wood. Well, as gardeners, we cover all the bare ground with mulch, and we pick up all the dead wood and we cut back all the dead stems. And so we're eliminating their habitat. And a lot of them are really highly endangered because they don't have any place to live, or they've laid their eggs in a twig or in the ground, and then we cover it up or we throw it in the compost. They are excellent pollinators. For some things, they're far better. Fruit trees, for example, they're far better pollinators than honeybees. So just they cover a broad range. I can't begin to talk to you about all 1,600 kinds, but I just want to give you a taste of a few of them. Just to give you the range, these pictures are on the same scale. This is a little sweat bee on the left and a carpenter bee on the right, both pretty common around here. So they range incredibly in size and what they look like. Just to focus on a few critical ones, these are squash bees. It turns out that honeybees really don't like the pollen in squash. It's like too big and sticky for them. So they don't generally pollinate squash plants. But these squash bees are specialized to that. Squash is a Native American plant. This is what they evolved with. And so they're excellent pollinators. The males actually sleep in the flowers overnight so that when they open up in the morning and the females come to collect pollen for the young, they're there waiting, hoping somebody will mate with them. And I'm on a lot of gardening forums, and a lot of people have been talking lately about, oh, my pumpkin gets about 2 inches across and then it just shrivels up and falls off the plant, or my zucchini. And I've experienced this in my garden as well. And it's because we don't have these squash bees. What's happening, it's not a disease or an issue of nutrition. If the fruit is not pollinated adequately, then the plant aborts it because there's no point in putting energy into it. And that's what's often happening. And so a lot of people are having to resort to pollinating their squash by hand. And you know what? Humans are not as good at this as the bees. Bumblebees are the pollinators for tomato plants. Tomatoes are not pollinated by honeybees. They need buzz pollination, which means they need a specific frequency of buzzing before they release their pollen. And so the bumblebee comes up. I've watched this in my own garden. It's so amazing. It comes up and you hear the buzz go, and it gets to a certain frequency that the plant is expecting, and all the pollen is released. It poofs out, covers the bee, and then it goes on to the next plant and it shares that pollen. So you can hear at the bottom, we have both of these bees are ground nesters. And I know in my own garden, I went in and did some mulching. And after that, I was like, oh, my squash is not doing very well. Oh, I need to leave some bare dirt for these guys that's loose enough that they can live in. So you can see them here, one of them here, one of the females coming out of one of her little tunnels. And then this is a mason bee, which are excellent pollinators of fruit trees. And they use cavities or tunnels into stems. So looking at the wild bee abundance in the US, this map shows, if you look at the bright yellow, that's where the numbers have dropped very low. And you'll notice that corresponds directly to the major agricultural areas, which is not where we want to be losing bees, because their habitat's just not there. It also has to do with pesticides and climate change. They're much more attuned to the timing of certain plants, but we're not doing a good job here keeping these guys around. And what we do not want to be is this parts of China where they've lost all the native bees and the people are having to go out and hand pollinate crops. First of all, I don't see that going here, finding people to do that. And second of all, we're not as good at it. The bees do a much more effective job. So this is not where we want to end up. So if we're trying to provide habitat for native bees, we need just ground that we're not disturbing, but that's fairly loose loam that they can get to, that's not completely covered in mulch, which doesn't mean your whole garden. You can mulch most of it, but leave some space for the bees as well in a back spot you're not going to disturb. Nesting boxes, we can, if we're not going to leave the dead branches and things, we can provide other habitat for them. Leaving the stems of things, not being so aggressive in our deadheading and getting rid of the old stems. You know, plants seem to manage before we started doing all that. And, you know, leaving pieces of dead wood and things like that around. Doesn't have to be in the front where people see it, but leaving some habitat for them. This is Tora, my partner, when she was at the Gardens for Lake Merritt. In a public garden, it's much harder to leave things around, leave it be messy. So she built this Airbnb or bee hotel, and it just has wood in it with various width holes, straw, all sorts of habitat. Now, in retrospect, we would not build one this big because now we know all about super spreader events, right? If you concentrate the creatures, you also tend to concentrate the pathogens and the predators. So this is great for teaching, but in reality, a few small things scattered through the garden would be a better functional fit. So you can see the ones that are kind of plugged up are the ones where the bees have gone inside. The other thing that most people are very interested in are butterflies. I mean, these are kind of the key ones we see around. The monarchs, the cabbage whites. If you've seen a white butterfly, it's a cabbage white. It's by far the most common. Anna swallowtails, tiger swallowtails, Gulf fritillaries, and then this pipevine swallowtail, which used to live throughout the Bay Area. In recent years, last 30 or 40 years, it's only come kind of as far south as Berkeley. There's a project going in San Francisco. Tim Wong is heading up to bring it back into the San Francisco area. And we've had a similar project going on in Oakland for about 8 years, and are starting to have some success bringing this swallowtail back by planting the host plant that it needs. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So I'm going to talk about butterflies and moths in general, but use monarchs as the model. And there's a study that's gone on at UC Davis for, I think it's 40 years now. Art Shapiro has done various land plots all through California that he checks constantly. So it's an incredible database on Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths. And they're all declining. In various numbers of it, there's variation, and the monarchs are basically kind of in the middle. There are others that are much worse off and others that are better off, but they're a good representative center, and they also have the best PR. I mean, they have whole national organizations dedicated to teaching about them and looking after them. So they tend to get all the attention. I always talk about how they have the best PR. But they're a good example of what's going on. So you've probably seen a ton of headlines in the last year about them. I won't go into all of these, but there's a lot of concern in particular about monarchs right now. But I would want to emphasize that this is true of all these populations. And there's that old, is it a blessing or a curse? May you live in interesting times. And a lot of what I'm going to show you tonight, I'm not going to tell you what to do or what the answer is because we don't know. But I am going to fill in what evidence we have and what observations, and would welcome input from you as well as we go forward. So when we talk about any insect, butterflies included, we see this life cycle. You start with the adult. The adult lays eggs. In this case, these are monarch eggs, these little pinpoints here. The egg hatches out into a larva, which if we're talking about moths or butterflies is a caterpillar. The caterpillar's total job is to eat and grow. Monarch caterpillars grow 2,000 times their size in 4 weeks. So if you had a 10-pound baby, that would be a 20,000-pound baby a month later if we grew at the same rate. That larva then becomes a pupa, it pupates. If we're talking about a butterfly, that's in a chrysalis. If we're talking about a moth, it's a cocoon. And then out of that emerges or ecloses the butterfly. So caterpillars are the original picky eaters. Each species of butterfly or moth has only one food that caterpillar can eat. And we call that the host plant, and it's different for each species. So monarch eggs, this is what a monarch egg looks like. This was a monarch laying eggs in my garden just this spring, which takes about 4 to 8 days to hatch. They're careful. I just learned this recently. The butterflies, if at all possible, are going to lay on a plant that doesn't already have eggs on it, because if a caterpillar hatches out and there's another egg on the plant or leaf, it will immediately go and eat it. So that is built in, and the butterflies can smell the eggs on the plant. So this is what it would look like under a scanning electron microscope. It's such an intricate structure for the brief time that it exists. So the caterpillar comes out. Actually, the first thing it does is eat the eggshell. And then it's in this caterpillar stage for 2 to 4 weeks, although with temperatures here, I've never seen it be less than 3 or 4. Insects, they're temperature dependent, and warmer weather, it's going to go faster. And all they do is eat. So they go through 5 stages or instars. Basically, they're growing so fast that their skin or exoskeleton can't keep up. So 5 different times during their growth, they actually grow a new exoskeleton, and it splits and they wiggle out of it kind of like a sleeping bag. They turn around and eat it. They're not going to waste any resources. And then they go on and into the next stage. So for monarchs, you probably know that the host plant is milkweed, of which there are a number of different species. Milkweed gets its name because when you tear it, you get this white latex sap that looks like milk. That sap is that, the milkweed and the monarchs have co-evolved. And so that sap is actually a defense of the plant against monarchs, against the caterpillars. And actually about 1/3 of the caterpillars, when they first come out of the egg and start nibbling on the milkweed, either get choked by it or it glues their jaws shut and they don't survive. So it's pretty effective, at least for 1/3 of the caterpillars. It also contains toxins, a cardiac glycoside, which the monarchs tolerate. And in fact, they incorporate it into their body, and it's a defense mechanism for them. As humans, I've been told, I have not tried tasting milkweed, but I've been told it's so noxious that you couldn't possibly eat enough to actually affect yourself with the toxin. However, if you're working around milkweed, you need to be very aware that the sap, if you get it in your eyes, it's really dangerous. So beware of that, wear gloves, wash your hands, watch out. Because of that toxin, eating a monarch has consequences. This is from, probably some of you remember this from your childhood, that old Time Life nature series. These were pictures by Lincoln Brower back in the 60s of the blue jay who makes the mistake of eating a monarch and then proceeds to barf. So we assume he's never going to do that again. Unfortunately, that doesn't deter all predators, not even all birds. Here's a Mississippi kite, very happy to munch on monarchs without any seeming consequences. There is also this parasitic protozoa. I'm going to call it OE. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this. No one does. Which for monarchs, it's unique to monarchs. They've evolved with it. It's in their population. I would have previously, we used to liken it to the flu, but it actually has close connections to COVID, because some monarchs are carriers without seeming to be particularly weakened by it, but some, if the load is heavy, will be quite deformed or not even emerge from the chrysalis. And we'll talk more about how that spreads shortly. There are also these tachinid fly parasites, which unfortunately have started to be sold as a biocontrol for other creatures. They actually lay their eggs inside the caterpillar, and then what emerges from the chrysalis is actually tachinid flies, not a butterfly. Paper wasps have come into California in the last 30 years or so. They're not native here, and they are really predatory on the caterpillars. They will just tear a caterpillar apart. And then there's a variety of other diseases they get that are bacteria and virus based. And they usually get just dumped under this title of Black Death because the caterpillar turns black and dies. So OE, so it's naturally occurring. They've been evolving with it. What happens, the way it's carried is an infected monarch lands on a milkweed plant, either to feed or to lay eggs. The spores fall off its belly onto the plant, and then any caterpillars that eat on that plant then ingest the spores. You can see here, these are the scales of a butterfly, and then these little black dots are the OE, and it's just like glitter. It just spreads across when the butterfly lands. So it goes from butterfly to plant to caterpillar. So it accumulates on plants. So one of the questions I get a lot is, what about the aphids on milkweed? What do I do about them? They're oleander aphids. They're these yellow aphids. They are not the same aphids people get on their roses, so the rosarians don't have to worry about this. They are on the plant. They don't seem to really damage the plant, and unless they get really bad, in which case you can kind of squish them and take it down. They come in, the ladybug larvae come in, various things come in, they clear, they come back. But I want to show, I particularly like this graphic because it shows a monarch egg here and all these aphids. There's nothing you can do to get rid of these aphids that's not going to damage this egg or a small caterpillar that's on this plant. So I tell people you just need to learn to love them. They show that your plant is pesticide free, which is really critical. And they're part of the ecosystem. They just don't have as good a PR. So they're part of it, and that's what we accept. There's also these milkweed bugs, which actually don't bother the plant too much. They do eat seeds, but milkweed plants produce a lot of seeds. So unless you're seed saving, they're not a problem for you. This red milkweed beetle, this milkweed tussock moth, and here's a lady beetle larva who they love those aphids. So, you know, it's not only a sign the plant is healthy, but it brings in these good predators that we want for our other plants. So milkweed, in addition to being a host plant, is a great nectar plant for all sorts of things. This great picture shows 2 honeybees and a male carpenter bee nectaring on the flowers of a milkweed plant. So it has that benefit as well. It serves a lot of other creatures. So there's this great milkweed controversy you may have heard about. There's all this talk about, you know, we're killing them because we plant the wrong milkweed and blah, 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 blah. I want to start just by saying it's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot. This is not what's killing the monarchs. Climate change and pesticide use are so much higher on the list. It is a factor. It's something to be aware of. But I have seen people come close to blows over this, and it's not worth that. So the issue is the native versus the non-native milkweed. So when we're talking about native milkweeds in our area, the most common one you come across is the narrow leaf, the fascicularis. Showy is also quite common, speciosa. Heart leaf or cordifolia is pretty hard to propagate, so you don't see it as much, but it's great. And then Californica, which is very rare right now. To find a plant like this, there's a huge project going right now to try to identify these plants and get seeds and try to figure out how to propagate them, because it comes up earlier than the other milkweeds. And right now with climate change, we have butterflies coming out of the overwintering sites earlier, and there's no milkweed. So there's a big project underway under the auspices of Fish and Game right now to try to figure out if we can get more of this milkweed out there. The non-native milkweeds, basically the non-natives, you're going to see either these red and yellow or just all yellow flowers. This is the tropical Chrysobica. And also this is the Physocarpa, which is a South African milkweed. It gets quite tall, like 4 to 5 feet, bigger leaves. And the way you can tell is it has these big round seed pods that are about 2 inches across. So it's called balloon plant, but also hairy balls and family jewels and that sort of thing. Also non-native. So here's the issue. With natives, you can't go wrong planting native milkweed. It's co-evolved with our local ecosystem. It goes dormant in the winter. So that OE accumulation I talked about, when it goes dormant in the winter, the plant starts out fresh in the spring. So you have no issue. There is some evidence that milkweed around when the monarch should be in diapause, in hibernation in the winter, that if we have milkweed around, which normally wouldn't be the case with the natives, it pulls them out of diapause. Controversial, but there's definitely evidence to that effect. And the downside of the natives is because we're having this issue with climate change where the monarch, it's warm and earlier, the monarchs are coming and looking for a food source, and our native milkweeds aren't up yet. So that's why we're very quickly looking into Californica. And in general, the natives make stronger monarchs. They're healthier if they feed on the native. So you can't go wrong planting pesticide-free native milkweed, and pesticide-free is really critical. The non-natives, they're not native to the local ecosystem, depends on how strongly you feel about it, but they are active all year. They have no dormant season. So disease and parasites accumulate. They can cue the monarchs out of diapause. And, but on the plus side, they are available in late winter before the natives come up. So right now we're not quite sure about whether this is going to be something we need to use. The monarchs who use it are not as strong, but they're functional. It increases the level of OE in the population, even when you cut it back frequently. So we did for a while say, cut it back in the fall. So it, it's like it's dormant and then it comes back clean. But the research now shows that even cutting it back frequently, it seems to contribute to OE for some reason. It can be invasive. Seeds spread easily into open spaces, and then you don't have people cutting it back. So that's of concern. And the problem's been that it's been highly available in nurseries and big box stores, and often treated with pesticides, systemic pesticides in particular, which means it remains toxic even though you've planted it as a food plant. So at this point, what we're saying is if you have the non-native, you really want the non-native, then at the very least, you need to cut it back frequently. And more will be coming out on this. This is certainly no conclusions have been reached. So I did want to talk just a minute about rearing monarchs. There are a lot of people who have been raising monarchs indoors or in cages in an effort to protect them. And I totally understand that. We've done it. It seems like the right thing to do. You definitely save that one monarch, and it's very effective in terms of education. I mean, I put them in classrooms for years, and you're changed once you see that process. And it also, if you're participating in citizen science, it's going to help us learn more about them. The things to know, however, is that it is now illegal in California per Fish and Wildlife to touch a monarch. It's a look but don't touch policy. So any of the rearing that's going on is technically illegal. Now, obviously, Fish and Wildlife does not have the wherewithal to enforce this. And it's actually kind of been on the books for a while, but it's being really emphasized right now. And this is true unless you're under a permit, which has to do with scientific study or education. And there is a permit in the works that we're going to be part of. The reason is one of the things that happened, we've learned, is indoor rearing really affects migratory behavior. If the caterpillars are not outside in natural conditions, They don't know it's winter. They don't know it's time to go to the coast. You're also not helping the overall monarch population by rearing. If our goal was to create a domesticated creature, that would be the point, but it's not. We want them migrating. We want them out in the wild. So, and also the problem with concentrating them in one space, we're now very aware of super spreader events, and you're concentrating disease and predation. So, and particularly if you're buying from a breeder, which has created all sorts of problems, that's really disadvantageous. So you need to be aware of all this if that is something that you're interested in doing. So I mentioned that, for monarchs, their host plant is milkweed. I'll show you in a minute a good way to find out, but for painted ladies, it's mallows, thistles, legumes. For the anise swallowtail, it's fennel or angelica. For Gulf fritillaries, it's passion vine. The cabbage family for brassicas, plantain, cudweed, toadflax for buckeyes. And for the pipeline swallowtail, it's pipevine. And you'll notice a lot of these are what we consider weeds. And so if we don't have these plants in the habitat, we're not going to have these butterflies. They have to have this food stuff for their caterpillars. One great way to find out, Calscape, if you're not familiar with it, is a website done by California Native Plants. And they have just done an incredible job. You put in your zip code and it brings up all the native plants. And then you can say, I want pollinator plants, or I want shade plants, or I want whatever. And then they've also added this whole category for butterflies. So if there's a certain butterfly in your area that you're interested in bringing into your yard, it will tell you what plants are necessary. It also puts these numbers around them. I don't think it's on this screen, which tells you how many pollinators use that plant. And I'll just tell you, oak is the top one. It supports the most pollinators, but not everybody has room for an oak. So once the caterpillars have eaten their milkweed, they crawl away from the milkweed generally, because they're going to be very vulnerable while they pupate. And they hang in this J shape for a couple of days. They're actually forming the chrysalis inside their skin or their exoskeleton. Moths wrap themselves in silk, that's a cocoon, but a chrysalis actually forms inside the body, and then it's going to split off. Up at the top here, they make this little silk button on the leaf or branch they're going to pupate on. And what they have there at the tail end is this cremaster, which basically somebody should have looked at this long before Velcro got invented, right? And that's how they hang onto the silk. So what happens is they hang there for 2 or 3 days. This week, I think it took about a day and a half in these temperatures. And they hang there, they form that chrysalis side. Then the skin splits. And this whole process takes less than a minute. The skin splits, they wiggle, 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 wiggle. They scoot that skin all the way up to the top. And then they unhook themselves, drop the skin, and then hook back on, which seems like a really impractical solution, but it works, they do it. And then the chrysalis is hanging there. They've basically liquefied inside the chrysalis. There's a few parts, the brain stem and a couple of other things that carry over, but they liquefy and completely reorganize themselves, although they do keep some memories from when they were caterpillars. So when the chrysalis first forms, it looks like this. The chrysalis itself is transparent. So what you're seeing inside here is basically their green hemoglyph that where they're liquefying. And then about 2 days before they come out, they're ready to eclose. Generally, they're in there for about 10 days. But again, totally temperature dependent. They, a couple of days before the colors come into the wings, the scales form, and you can actually see the colors forming right before they emerge. And so when it's time to emerge, the chrysalis cracks open, the butterfly crawls out. At this point, you can see the wings are totally compressed. They look like wet toilet paper. I also want to point out the proboscis. So they're now going to be a liquid nectar drinking insect. And so this proboscis, which is sort of like a combination of a straw and a sponge, they have grown this inside, but it was wrapped around, it was in two halves inside the chrysalis, wrapped around their head, kind of like a Princess Leia hairdo on both sides. And as they're emerging from the chrysalis, they unfurl it and they zip the two halves together. And then the wings are pumped up. You can see all the fluid that's in the abdomen. It's pumped into the wings and then they harden. And this all takes about an hour. Now, I want to point out that only 1 to 5% of eggs make it from egg to adulthood. The other 95% are a critical part of the food chain or food web. They're not intended all to make it, or at least that's not how nature has worked. And so sometimes we feel like we have to save every individual one. But again, these are the guys with the good PR. There's lots of other creatures that are dependent on them in the habitat. Excuse me. And just to show you some of the other chrysalids, some of the other butterflies, we love to point this out to gardeners, how much, if you're pruning things and cutting things back, you're never going to notice these. You're just going to cut the branch off and toss them in the compost, hopefully. And we're going to lose this generation. So being a neat gardener is not really very productive from a habitat standpoint. So we really vote for lazy gardening. So here you can see that proboscis I was talking about. You can actually sort of see the seam in it. Now they're used, as a butterfly, it's now a nectar drinking creature, which actually can taste with its feet, so it knows which flowers it wants to stop at. Now, unlike the other butterflies, the moths, monarchs migrate, which is one of the reasons they have so many supporters. So there are basically two populations. There is some crossover. Used to be thought they were completely separate, but we know in Arizona, some guys go one way, some go the other. And this migration was only discovered, the Eastern migration, in 1974, which is not that long ago, by American scientists. The Mexican people knew where they were, but probably no one thought to ask them. So there's the Eastern population, which is everything east of the Rockies. They migrate to Mexico, the mountains of Mexico in the winter. Basically, they go there. It's a Goldilocks kind of situation. It's not so cold that they freeze, and it's not so warm that they have to be eating and breeding. They can stay in this suspended state called diapause through the winter. Then in the spring, that first generation flies, that generation that's been overwintering flies out, usually gets to southern Texas where the milkweed is coming up. They lay their first round of eggs. That generation flies on, lays eggs. Next generation flies on, lays eggs. So 4 or 5 generations in at the end of the summer, from the cues they're getting about day length and temperature, and the milkweed dying back, that last generation, actually, when it comes out of the chrysalis, it's already had the cues to know that it's winter is coming, and it flies all the way back. The single butterflies fly all the way back to Mexico. They do stop along the way and eat. They actually gain weight on that trip, getting their resources together to get them through the winter. So then that winter generation, the normal generations live 4 to 6 weeks as butterflies. This generation can live up to 8 or 9 months. And this is what it looks like hanging in the trees in Mexico. And they're not breeding, they're not eating. They may flutter around a little bit on a warm day, but they're basically just conserving their resources until the weather is better for them. So that population, we basically have been measuring it in acres. It's very convenient of them to all go to one place for us to count them. In 96, 97, there were 45 acres of them in Mexico. As of 1920, we were down to, or to 2020, we were down to 5.2 acres, which was a 26% drop from last year, but which had been a step up. So they seem to be sitting kind of in this range for right now. There's a little bit of concern this year because when they left the overwintering grounds this year and headed to Texas, it was right after that freeze, that incredible freeze we had in Texas this year. So we don't know what the status of the milkweed plants are and how they're going to do from there. So the Western population, our guys, they don't go to a single site. They go to up to 300 sites along the coast of California. Some like Pacific Grove and some you would never even know about, like the San Leandro Golf Course. They hang in trees along the coast. Again, it's that Goldilocks on the coast. It's not going to freeze, but it's not going to be so warm they need to eat or breed. And then in the spring, they migrate out to the east and north, getting as far north as Washington or the Canadian border. And then in the fall, they use those same cues to come back. So the Western population, Xerces Society has been doing a count since 1997 at Thanksgiving and also at New Year's to look at all these sites. The blue looks great because it's going up, but that's the number of sites being monitored. The green bars are the population. So we've gone from 1.2 million monarchs in 1997 down to about 200,000 in 2017. And it was the population was kind of sitting there relatively stable for a number of years. And then in 2018, we had this crash and they dropped down to 30,000, less than 30,000 individuals, which 30,000 had been predicted as the tipping point for the population. So this was very concerning. And then in 2019, we had that same about 30,000. So all of a sudden, a lot of these national groups that have been mostly focused on the Eastern population have become very interested in what's happening in California. And then we got 2020, which, as we all know, was a dumpster fire in so many ways, right? So at the Posse, we had people getting in touch with us, and we were getting all these calls and all these inquiries. One of the things we know is that the monarchs left the overwintering sites about 4 to 6 weeks earlier than they traditionally had. That's been happening more and more as we get these warm spells in January and February, and they leave. Problem is, there's no milkweed yet. Then I have a garden here, and we have the gardens at Lake Merritt that we monitor. Typically in the Bay Area, we see monarchs in the early spring as they're coming through to migrate out. And then there's a few residents, but very few through the summer months. And then mid-September, when they're coming back, we get a generation. This year, every day I went out my garden, starting in May and June, there were eggs being laid. There were monarchs everywhere. I was getting all these calls. There are monarchs here. It's so great. It's so great. They're laying eggs in my garden, which did feel great. We were getting a lot of questions about people who were rearing because they were there and they were home for COVID. And so they were bringing them in to protect them. But we're in touch with the groups in the Pacific Northwest, and they were seeing none. So they were hanging out here and they weren't migrating. And that continued to happen into the winter. We were still getting eggs in November and December, which sounds great, except they're temperature dependent, and it's really not a very productive time for them to be breeding. And then we started hearing, we're not seeing them at the overwintering sites. What's going on? In the midst of all this in December, Fish and Wildlife Service had been considering the monarch for threatened and endangered species status. And they came out with their report. And what they said was it was warranted, but precluded by work on higher priority listing actions. And basically what they said is the monarch deserves protection and needs protection, but we have 160 other species that are ahead in line, and we just can't deal with it right now. So it is because we were curious, because I do some reporting for the Western Monarchs Advocates Group. I didn't feel comfortable as a scientist reporting anecdotal stories, so we started a survey. And we had about 140 people throughout the greater Bay Area reply. And sure enough, they were reporting what I had seen all summer long: eggs, caterpillars, butterflies. This was unprecedented. There were always a few residents, but nothing like this. We asked what kind of milkweed was around. There was a lot of native, but there was also a lot of non-native. And we asked about rearing, and we found that 3 times as many people were rearing as had reared in the past. Everybody was home. They were trying to protect the butterflies. They were bringing them indoors, and 2/3 of those were being reared indoors. So they weren't getting the cues that winter was coming. And when I first talked to some of the scientists about my concerns about this, they said, oh, rearing, it's not significant. But I have record now of over 3,600 butterflies that were released in the Bay Area just from my 140 people. And 2/3 of those were reared indoors. So that is significant when we look at the numbers we're seeing. And then we got the count at Thanksgiving, and it was just shocking. There were a total of only 1,914 individual butterflies in all the overwintering sites. Pacific Grove had 0. Natural Bridges had 50. Ardenwood, 0. All these places that had been butterfly places for so long and had built reputations on it had no butterflies at all. Yet we were seeing breeding inland. So, and by Christmas, that count was down to just barely 1,000. So this was upsetting, as you can imagine. So the question is, what's going on? And this is where the experts are right now. It's a combination of factors. The primary one, they believe, is climate change. California is actually warming faster than the rest of the country. We have these warm spells in January and February that are causing the butterflies to leave early, to be out of sync with their native milkweed. And we have this continued mating activity in the winter when it's not to their advantage. They're using resources when very few of those young are going to survive. And my concern about this is we had a very mild winter this year. I just looked in Oakland. We had only one night under 40 degrees all winter long. But there are years we get a serious freeze for a week at a time. And had that happened this year, that would have wiped all those resident ones away from the coast out. The second factor they believe is toxins in the environment. Xerxes just did a study recently where they sampled milkweed from all over California. I mean, they went into backyards of people who had been organic gardeners for years. They went to hedgerows, they went to ditches, they went to wherever they could find milkweed. There was not a single sample that had less than 2 toxic chemicals that they tested for anywhere. And we're very seriously concerned about the neonicotinoid pesticides, which are very frequently applied at wholesale nurseries and stores. They're based on nicotine. They're systemic, so once the plant is treated, it is toxic for its whole life. And because they're based on nicotine, they're actually addictive. So it's in the nectar, it's in the plant itself. And so there's a lot of lobbying efforts. I actually have a meeting on Friday with someone from a health professional who's working with the group to try to get these banned. Europe has banned them. There's a lot of anecdotal stuff, and studies are starting to come out that when you hear about the insect crash, it often coincides with the introduction of neonicotinoids in a particular area. So we really need to get on this. And one of the problems is you may ask at your local nursery if it's been treated, and they may not know because the wholesale nursery they bought from treated. And it's because they say, you know, nobody wants to buy plants that has a little bit of chewing on it. They want perfect plants. And that's why we need to change our standards. So the other factors are the non-native milkweed is definitely a factor because it accumulates the OE. And I'm concerned about this number being raised in captivity, which now, since the ruling is that it's illegal, we'll see what happens with that. We're trying to get the word out that that's the case. But OE has increased from 1% to 18% in the last 20 years. And concentrating caterpillars in captivity really contributes to that. So one of the things we're asking people to do is to help us figure it out. We have this ongoing survey. Since that survey we did that last year, I'm asking people to report in on a monthly basis what they're seeing in their areas. There are some other larger projects, although most of these have not been, well, the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge, which is over for this year, is an early spring activity based on iNaturalist. You can report on iNaturalist or Journey North or some of these national projects as well. And I'm actually going to be putting together a write-up on our website about what the advantages and difficulties of each of these projects are. So that's kind of the end of what I want to talk about what we're seeing. I want to go on and talk about the work that we do. So the Posse, one of the things we do, Tora Rocha here is speaking. She has a lot of credibility in the world of professional landscapers because she worked for a city government for many years. She has a very realistic take. And so they really love to hear from her. So she's become part of the Bay Friendly training for municipal gardeners and various talks like that. So she's busy doing that, working with the nursery trade, working with landscapers. We've become partners in recent years with Western Monarch Advocates, which is the whole West Coast, Monarch Joint Venture, Xerxes, and World Wildlife Fund, who are national organizations. Like I say, since with what's been happening, there's much more of a focus on California and the Western monarch population right now. We do a lot of public outreach. This is the gardens at Lake Merritt. The gardens at Lake Merritt were the first wildlife refuge in the country. They predate any of the national parks. This is how we landscape it. It's really, it's lawn and non-natives. There's very little habitat here other than these little islands out in the lake, which are designed for the birds. When Tora was over this park, she was learning about this 10, 15 years ago. She started planting a lot of pollinator habitat or leaving the weed plants, which are host plants. And she started getting a lot of complaints, as you can imagine. Aren't you doing your job? Why aren't you weeding? And she put these signs out. And lo and behold, letting people know what's going on is really critical, because those same people who had complained proceeded to write her back and thank her for what she was doing. So perception is a huge part of it, and letting people know the reason and that we need to do this and that we're doing it for habitat. We do a lot of public presentations, gardening clubs and various groups. And our focus is, are you a conqueror or a steward of your ecosystem? We're still gardening like we live in the 18th century. A lawn like this is basically a food desert for any creature. And in fact, with pesticide and herbicide use, it's actually a landmine. We can do better. One of the messages we have to get across is that pollinator friendly is also beautiful. This is way prettier than that lawn. And I often, because I have converted all my lawn to habitat gardening, it's way easier to maintain. The 2 hours spent mowing the lawn every week for a lawn that didn't look that good compared to doing kind of a major pruning once a year, it's much easier and much more beautiful. And one of the tools we provide on our website is this chart that Tora's put together for landscapers when you're planning landscaping. It shows these are the months of the year and then the color of bloom of these various plants. Because one of the things we need especially with climate change, is year-round nectar sources for the pollinators. So if you have a color scheme in your garden, and you're looking for certain months of color, this is a really useful tool. We do a number of events. We just did one this last weekend, our first public since. This is one we've been doing for a while called Teas for Bees. It raises awareness at golf courses, which are huge pesticide and herbicide users. We've actually gotten one of our golf courses to get Audubon certified recently, and they're talking to us about lots of habitat things. They need to keep their the greens clear, but there's so much rough and open areas. So we get classroom groups of volunteers of kids to make these seed balls. And then we have an event at the golf course where kids hit the seed balls into the rough of the golf course. And Tora has this vision that, instead of going to Folsom Lake and trampling all the wildflowers there, people can go to the local golf course for brunch and take their pictures with all the wildflowers in the rough. So that's our goal. This particular project won the Jefferson Award for Tora, so KPIX did a whole thing on it. The other big event that Tora is responsible for is the Autumn Lights Festival. It takes place at the Gardens at Lake Merritt in October. We will be live this year, third week in October. And it's 180, the gardens around Lake Merritt is a botanic garden. And it's about 5 acres. And we have 180 artists who do light installations in the garden. And then there's food trucks and music and all sorts of things you wander through. We have a display. This is our display, which are these giant silk butterflies, 16 times life size, and they're host plants. That's called Pollinator Perspective. It's ours, but that's only one of 180 displays. And it's just an incredible event. So that'll be going online shortly. We've just gotten approval on the dates. So I highly recommend that as an opportunity. It turns out those butterflies, once I created them for Autumn Lights, turned out to be extremely useful for other things during the day. This is at a nature center at the lake. This is part of a setup. We use signage, so it's an educational setup as well. I've started to do these panels of native bees so we can get the word out. We table at other people's events. This is the National Heirloom Expo that takes place in Santa Rosa, usually in the fall. It's a 3-day event. And they bus kids in on field trips. So in the 3 days, we've had 1,100 kids come through our booth. And we do a number of things with them. I'll talk about that more when I get into the details of the activities. And we have this Pipevine Swallowtail project where we're encouraging and mapping people to plant the pipevine, which is the host for this beautiful blue butterfly, and in process of bringing it back. And we've now had eggs in Oakland the last 3 years. These were part of our first generation of butterflies. So that project is growing. This is a new project. Oakland Unified School District has Oakland Goes Outdoors initiative to get kids into parks and camping and things. With COVID, they had to go virtual. And so they contacted people who do science and natural history work. And so we're creating these short videos. The idea being middle school students would go to a park with their parents and do whatever activity is explained in the video. And so we have the first couple that are up, and the rest will be going up shortly. We do classroom visits and field trips, both to the gardens at Lake Merritt, and this is a 4th grade classroom. This teacher did seed ball making in her classroom, bless her heart. And it was wonderful for Teas for Bees. So my passion is explaining pollination to people so they understand. I have seen so many bad explanations or asked kids after they've supposedly learned about pollination what it's about, and been pretty horrified by the results. So what I wanted to do is just run through the sequence that I have come to that I use when I go to classrooms or when I'm working with groups of kids as to what pollination is and why it's important. And of course, it starts with plants. So many kids will tell you, why are flowers? And they tell you it's to feed the bees. I mean, it's very mixed up. And I've been in workshops with teachers who discovered what pollination was after they've been teaching for years. So this is kind of my mission. So I start with why are plants important? Kids brainstorm ideas. And then I ask them what their favorite foods are. Pizza usually comes up, and then we work through the idea that everything they eat, with the exception of water and salt, comes from a plant. And that plants provide
a lot of good things for us. They provide shelter.
Oh, I'm sorry. This has
clothing.
Video on it. I'm going to go past that. So to survive, plants must grow and make food. They need sunlight and water and all those things. But what kids never bring up is to survive that they have to reproduce. So we bring that. We need more plants. And to reproduce, they need to make seeds. And to make seeds, they need flowers. And it's very surprising to kids that the purpose of flowers is to make seeds often, and to some adults. So what we do next, usually in a classroom or in a group setting, is I bring up these flowers that we're going to do a guided drawing activity of a flower like this tulip. If I'm out in the field, I carry a little whiteboard and we do it there. In their science journals. In a classroom, I might do it on the board. On Zoom, I have an extra camera. We do that. And then we're going to cut this flower open and we're going to look at what's inside. And this is actually the diagram I did with some kids earlier this week, where going back to the whole idea of nature journaling, that this is a scientific drawing. It's not an artist's drawing. Our goal is to have information, not to make it perfect, not to make it look good. So they're not caught up in that the labeling is important. And in the end, that to get a seed, you need one piece of pollen and one ovule. Now, if I'm in a classroom, we often do a flower dissection. These alstroemeria are the best. You can always get them at Safeway. The parts are all really clear. I used to, when I was a classroom teacher, whenever it was Teacher Appreciation Week, I would have, I'd get this whole variety of flowers from everybody and we would dissect those. So it's great if you have a mixture of flowers, but this always works. And the kids take them apart. They make a museum exhibit for other kids in the class, and then they tour the classroom. And then getting that idea across that flower, the petals are going to fall off and it's going to turn, that ovule is then going to grow into the fruit or the seed pod. I actually just found this great video this week. I'll share this with you so you have this link. That's a time lapse of pear flowers growing to a pear. So it starts here with the buds and it goes through these stages. And then you see the petals fall away and the ovules start to grow into the pear, which makes it much clearer to kids what's going on. There's a nature journaling activity that comes from Jack Law's work that I really like as well, if you're out in the field doing environmental ed. And this shows it as doing it by date, but I've done it with him as well, where you find a plant, blackberries work, poppies work at the right time of year, and you have the kids find the perfect one, which is usually the perfect flower, and draw that, and then go forward in time, find examples of what happens after that, and find examples of what happened before that. And they just basically discover that ovary starts to grow into the seed. So that is super effective. So once we've done our drawing or whatever we're going to do, we go back to this idea that plants produce all the food on Earth. So how is that fair? Kids are very concerned about fairness. What do they get out of the deal? We're taking all their food. And we talk about how plants have a problem because they need to get the pollen that we've talked about from this flower to the ovule of a different flower. And how are they going to do that because they can't move? And there's always somebody in the group who knows that there are pollinators who do that. We look at brainstorm what the different pollinators are. And problem solved. They basically hired their friends to help them out. The pollinator is going to get nectar and some extra pollen, and the plant's going to get their pollen carried, and they're going to be able to make seeds, and everybody's happy. So when we go to events, one of the things, or classrooms as well, I have these great little microscopes. These, well, they were $10 when I bought them. I just looked at them on Amazon today. They're $13. They're spectacular. I have them set up with lots of tape so nobody can change anything, with a butterfly wing, with a bee head, with a bee body, so kids can actually look. And adults, adults are blown away by this. They've never seen these things as well. So as part of my mini museum with some other things, these are super effective. And if you haven't set them up, they're just such a handy tool in the field. You want the 20 to 40. There are some that come with higher magnification, but that's not going to work very well with the 3D kinds of stuff you put in them. The activity I do at many of these events is I have these foam flower models. You can see it in the background here. It's standing up. And then I have these finger puppets of a bee, a monarch, a swallowtail, a bat, and a hummingbird. And kids come to the table. I ask them if they can help today with pollination. They get to pick which they're going to be. The bat is very popular. And then we go to one of these models, and then I've set the other one way down at the other end of the table, and we get pollen on us, and we do that. And then I say, well, now what are we going to do? We need to get that pollen to that flower. How are we going to do it? And you just see it dawn on them that, oh, that's why. So we fly over to the other flower, they leave their pollen, and then depending on our budget, they either get honey sticks or these old-fashioned wax candies that are filled with nectar, sugar water, as their reward for pollinating, because pollinators get rewarded. When we don't have the budget for this, or it's too many kids, like when we had 1,100 kids come through, what I did was I went and got a wreath at Michael's and sprinkled cheddar cheese powder on it, which you can buy on Amazon in quantity. It's basically that powder that's in Kraft macaroni and cheese. And I would just cut 2 lengths, a yellow and a black pipe cleaner, which they wrapped around their finger. And they visited the wreath, and then they flew over, and I just had some flower cutouts. We'd put a little glue stick in the middle, and they would land, and they could see the pollen transfer. And then again, they would get paid either with honey or with nectar. And they had a lot of fun with that. Our kind of signature thing we do at many events is these little Airbnbs or bee condos. We basically go to Michael's and get these little wooden bird houses. And then the kids cut the straws to paper straws to put in them and decorate them with craypas. And they love to do that, and then they can take them home and hang them in their garden. Now, when our budget is low, the budget bee hotels are basically colored toilet paper tubes with duct tape on the end. And then again, the straws go in, they can decorate these and take them home. This is that 4th grade classroom I mentioned, making the seed balls that we then use for Teas for Bees. This teacher is super. And then we have a series of drawing activities that we provide and just have available. All of these are online if you want to download them. And they're basically that draw a format that shows you the steps with the labeling, and then the kids can draw them up above. I just discovered today my honeybee one is not very accurate. I've got to rework that. But we also have a swallowtail butterfly and a monarch butterfly and a monarch caterpillar. And kids really like that. And these butterfly finger puppets are a huge hit. The butterfly cut it out, and then this is the finger part that goes underneath, and seeing a bunch of kindergartners flapping around with these is quite impressive. And then we have these pollinator masks that are out there as well that were developed by Kids Going Strong. And there's a bee and a butterfly, and I think there's a bat and a hummingbird too. So that's what we do. We're happy to take donations. We're all volunteers, so anything we get goes into supplies or seed or plants or something that goes directly to pollination. You can donate on our website if you'd like to do that. So I always like to let people know that. And we're out to change the world, one pollinator at a time. So I'm going to stop my share there and take any questions we have at this point.
Thank you. That was so amazing. I can't even believe how much content was in that presentation. Before I get to the specific questions in the chat, is there anybody online right now that has a question you want to just unmute and ask?
Turn the light on.
Okay. So a couple of questions. One question was, how do honeybees get the pollen grains off of their hairy bodies?
Okay. Partly they don't care, but the ones that they want to keep that they're taking back for the brood, their front legs have kind of a sweeping comb on them. And then the back legs have what they call pollen baskets, but what they really are just the side of the leg has almost a comb on it. So as they brush back, the pollen collects there, and the pollen is sticky and prickly. It sticks to itself. And so they gradually just build up these saddlebags of pollen that they can then take back to the hive.
Thank you. So there was one comment about how amazing the native bee poster was. So I just want to make sure you saw that.
Thank you.
So Elaine wants to know, what is the current thought about where to plant milkweed? She has heard that we shouldn't plant it within 5 miles of the ocean. She lives in the hills of San Mateo and grows narrow leaf and showy milkweed. Should she remove it?
No, she's fine in San Mateo. We don't want it close to the overwintering sites, particularly the tropical, because it's going to last through the winter and cause that triggering. The narrow leaf is going to go dormant anyway, so it's really not an issue. And talking to Xerxes, who are the most rigid about the guidelines, they're basically saying if you're in the Bay Area, you're okay, unless you're right at an overwintering site.
Great. And then Bill and Kathy, you might want to expound on this. They ask, where do the toxic chemicals come from? And can you explain more in reference, Bill or Kathy?
Yeah, this was my question, and I didn't phrase it very well. But
Okay.
You had a slide that showed that every, I think it was every native garden.
Well, it wasn't just native gardens. They sampled all over the place, but there were definitely, there were Xerxes employees who knew they had not sprayed anything in the time they had the garden.
Right.
And they looked at, I think it was 60 chemicals. They weren't all pesticides, but they were toxins. I don't know how they decided on that list. I think of toxins that they could test for and that they know are in the environment. Some of them were more kind of manufacturing oriented. And just what they found is testing the plants that everything showed up with at least 2 toxins.
So is this like from atmospheric deposition?
Well, there's no way of knowing for sure because you're just picking up plants in places. So, like the people in their backyard who hadn't done anything, of course, you don't know what the people before used, what was left in the soil from whatever had gone on there. Certainly in agricultural areas, it's clearly from pesticide use. And I think vehicles and manufacturing that may have been in the area it just makes us aware how many toxins have been absorbed. And that's one of our concerns about neonicotinoids. Not only are they in the plant, but they go into the soil, and it takes at least 8 years to clear them.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's distressing.
And Elaine wanted to know if you provide access to the slide on public presentations where you had that great picture of, are you a conqueror or a steward? She thought that
I found that on the internet. I'm not really good about giving credit in some of my slides. So if you go out searching for it, I mean, I'm out there a lot looking for things that support what I want. I mean, I'd be happy to, if you want to email, I'd be happy to share the JPEG with you, but it's out there.
Wonderful. All right, last chance for any pressing questions or comments.
If I could just ask, I had understood that the nicotinoids had last for 2 years, but you're saying they last for 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the reference for that because that's something I picked it up from Tora, who did some of the research on it. But that's what I have been told, because they're also water soluble, and so they travel.
Huh. And then what about Roundup? Is that something that lasts?
You know, I don't know about the length of time. It certainly lasts longer than Monsanto tells us that it just disappears. But the biggest well, there are two problems. There, you know, toxin issues are starting to come out about it after we were told for so long that it wasn't toxic. But the other thing is because it creates these monocultures. You know, it's the GMO crops that are adapted to Roundup that allow them to do, you know, miles on miles of soybeans or corn or whatever with nothing else, that makes those areas a desert for pollinators. But there are more and more we're hearing about toxic issues with it as well.
All right. Well, I am just so appreciative of your immense amount of knowledge. Obviously, the topic is a little bit disheartening, but you know, the work that you're doing is really amazing. And I think all of us feel, you know, more empowered to go forward and help spread the word about, you know, how serious this issue is and, you know, how we can educate others about it. And thank you so much for letting us record it, because I know a lot of people will watch the video of this.
Good. Yeah. And if you could send me the link, that would be great too.
I'd be happy to. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time. And thank you, Terry, so much for your time. This was incredible. And it's lovely to see
good.
all of you.
Thank you. And thank you for the work that you're doing. I mean, educating kids that's the way things are going to change. They get outraged about this stuff.
Yeah. And just like you say, one butterfly at a time, it's one child at a time, one person at a time, you know, it's good work we're all doing. Wonderful. Well, good night, everyone. And thank you. Take care.